Khan came to the attention of many of us first due to his ethical whistleblowing in relation to the Iraq War, where he was unwilling to tolerate the lies about that war that were being purveyed by the government of which he was a diplomatic representative. He used that forced departure from the diplomatic service, I think, to great purport and consequence by founding Independent Diplomat, which he may be mentioning, I don't know, in his talk. Independent Diplomat basically has sought to help states which have got inadequate diplomatic representation to intervene in the diplomatic sphere in such a way as to level the international playing field and enhance the possibility for there being international, ethics applied in the sphere of diplomacy. And in recent years, among other things, Khan has been working for E3G, the environmental think tank. And so he's been turning his attention increasingly over the last several years to climate diplomacy, ecological diplomacy, as it's often crucially called nowadays. And obviously that is a key part of the backdrop for why he's speaking with us here today. One more thing about Khan, he is a wonderful author as well, and has written a fascinating book called The Leaderless Revolution, with a sort of pragmatic anarchist vision of what democracy ought to look like. And I think we'll be touching on some themes from that as well in this morning's talk. Khan, I hope that serves as an introduction. Over to you. We're fascinated to hear what you've got to say to us about this, well, extremely crucial topic, which is very close to the heart of many of us, of course, in the Climate Majority Project. Khan.
Thank you very much, Rupert. Thank you, everybody, for coming to this seminar. I appreciate you getting up in the morning and attending first thing in the morning. I'm going to talk about how we go about climate change diplomacy, the current system, potential other systems, what is wrong with the current system, and what we might do about it. Do please interrupt if I'm being too technocratic. It is, unfortunately, and this is one of the problems, a very technocratic process. But let's start with talking about the sort of conventional theory of change, and I'll go through 3 or 4 theories of change in order, starting with where we are now and progressing to where we need to go. The conventional system is, of course, the government-to-government diplomacy of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, the annual COPs, Conference of the Parties, that we're all familiar with. This is the paradigm of how governments internationally are dealing with climate. It is obviously a failure in terms of what the science requires. The collective commitments of governments under the UNFCCC, in theory, take us to warming of close to 3 degrees centigrade, 2.9, I think is the current estimate, if all countries implemented their commitments under the UNFCCC, which, of course, they're not doing either. So that target, that estimate will doubtless be overshot. In any case, that degree of heating is a disaster for humanity. So I think it's easy to conclude that the UNFCCC is a failure. There are many reasons it's a failure. Above all, it's, of course, because government commitments themselves to decarbonize are insufficient. And the UNFCCC is, in a sense, a kind of aggregate of those national commitments. One of my personal concerns about the process is that it is very obscure. It's quite hard to understand. The COP itself is a kind of silly acronym. The process is bedeviled by all kinds of terminological obscurities, such as the Loss and Damage Fund, just transitions, and the crucial nationally determined contributions themselves, the actual commitments to decarbonize. These are not terms that are widely understood. They serve to make the process obscure and inaccessible to people more widely. the crucial reports from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, are incredibly opaque. I wonder if anybody here has tried to read them. I've tried to read them, and I find them very difficult to understand. Obscured in the last one, for instance, was several references to the need for demand restraint, for the control of demand, of consumption itself. This was unnoticed by the journalists reading the latest report. This, of course, refers to the theory of degrowth, that we need to stop growing the economy if we are to meet the Paris targets of 1.5 to 2 degrees of heating and net zero by 2050. It's easy to point out the flaws of the UNFCCC system, and some people dismiss it entirely and say we should not bother with it. I once had this conversation when I was running Independent Diplomat, which Rupert has referred to, when our client, as we called them, was the Marshall Islands, a tiny archipelago of low-lying states in the South Pacific. And I was having this conversation with the climate envoy, later the foreign minister of the Marshall Islands, Tony de Bruym, a remarkable man. And I said to him, look, the UNFCCC is rubbish. Why don't you boycott it? And he thought for a minute. And, you know, he was thinking as a man who thought very much about future generations of his island population, a very vulnerable country, uniquely vulnerable, almost uniquely vulnerable to sea level rise. And he said, well, the UNFCCC, the COP, is at least a place where we have a voice. We are a tiny island. We are ignored in most diplomatic processes. And there we can say what we really think. And that is important. So I don't want to boycott it. The question is, how can we make the most of it? And that was the beginning of a multi-year effort to promote the Marshall Islands and Tony himself as a leader in climate diplomacy. And they convened ever larger multilateral meetings of groups of countries, starting in the Pacific and the island states. And eventually in Paris surfaced this coalition of countries, and it was called the High Ambition Coalition. Eventually it became a group of 100 countries. That High Ambition Coalition is largely why we talk about the Paris targets as the kind of standard of government action. It's why we have the target of 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. Before the High Ambition Coalition came along, the target was just 2 degrees centigrade. It's why we have net zero by 2050. It's why countries have to return every 5 years with new commitments, the new NDCs under the UNFCCC. In other words, that coalition led by the Marshall Islands, one of the most vulnerable states, made a real difference to that process. Now, all of you being informed about climate will know that the Paris targets are not themselves enough. Net zero by 2050 is not enough. We need to get to net zero much earlier than that. And it doesn't even look like we're going to hit the Paris targets. But in any case, my point is that Tony de Bruym and the Marshall Islands made a real difference to that process. And he, of the most vulnerable countries, decided to engage with that process. And I think if he engages with it, then the rest of us would be wrong to dismiss it. The UNFCCC is not, as sometimes depicted, a lowest common denominator process where we just reduce the agreed outcome to whatever Saudi Arabia or Russia will agree. There is a certain kind of group process going on where countries feel pressured to improve their commitments under the treaty, under the agreement. There's a kind of groupthink that goes on. So it's not a lowest common denominator process. It is more than that. But, you know, all of this said, it is still inadequate. Now, what then can we do to improve that process? Well, one of the big impediments to national climate action, particularly by developed countries, is the fear that their industries will be undercut by other countries exporting to them that have not decarbonized as fast as them. This is in the technocracy known as carbon leakage. It is a serious obstacle to, in particular, industrial decarbonisation, the so-called hard-to-abate industries, such as steel, cement, concrete, etc., which make up a very significant proportion of global emissions. One way around this problem is what's called a climate club, whereby a group of countries gather together and agree a common standard for decarbonisation, let's say, of steel, and agree to penalise imports into their club that do not meet those decarbonisation standards. In other words, they stop the carbon leakage. The EU is an example of this kind of climate club, and in many ways, in fact, I think, as far as I know, the only example of such a climate club. And the EU is in the process of imposing essentially tariffs, what are known as CBAMs, if you want to get into the jargon again. They're in the process of imposing tariffs on high carbon imports of steel. There's two ideas behind this. One is that it stops their own industries being undercut by higher carbon exporters from outside the club. And the second is that they drive up global standards in that way, that exporters, such as, say, from India or China, are then pressurized to improve their own decarbonisation standards and progress in order to export to the climate club, because, of course, a substantial proportion of China's exports in steel, for instance, go to the EU. So China is thereby incentivized to improve its decarbonisation. China, as I'm sure you all know, is decarbonising quite fast in any case, but let's just look at this example. So in theory, a climate club would therefore remove one of the major impediments to industrial decarbonisation. And that is true. There's no question that that will happen. William Nordhaus, the famous economist, wrote a paper in 2015 where he suggested that carbon clubs of this kind, or tariffs on high carbon imports, would dramatically improve decarbonisation performance in industry, which was otherwise totally inadequate. But there are problems with the climate club, which are significant. So one problem that is often mentioned is that exports from countries that have not decarbonised fast enough, in particular from the global south, less developed countries, will be penalised. And of course, that's partly the point. They will be penalised. But that will affect those countries in the global south, less developed countries, in a very punitive way. Their development will be impeded. Now, the answer to that problem is often mooted that, well, we need to promote decarbonisation in these countries through this practice called just transition, whereby there is no broader cost to decarbonisation, for instance, in unemployment, social disbenefits, etc. But the trouble is that the money is not showing up. You're probably familiar with the $100 billion commitment that the global north made to pay the global south several years ago to fund the energy transition. The global north, the EU, America, etc., has only just met that target. In I think last year they met the 100 billion a year target for the first time. Whether they continue to meet it is another question. Of course, the future US administration is a big question mark over all of this. But in any case, 100 billion isn't anything like enough to fund the energy transition. It is estimated that a green transition in the global south will cost maybe $1 trillion a year. And this is one of the biggest untalked about problems in the whole challenge of world decarbonisation, is the immediate upfront cost. We all know that long-term solar and wind cost less than carbon-based energy sources, but the initial cost is significant. And for heavily indebted countries, for instance, it is a cost that they cannot bear. So they need to get money either from private investment or from public funds, public development aid to pay for that transition. And it's not arriving. That money is not turning up. There's a big discussion about how to mobilize that money in different ways. It's no question in my mind that is not going to come from aid alone. It will have to come from some kind of mobilization of private capital, which itself poses many problems. How do you mobilize private capital that does not want to go to the global south because of the risks? But also, do you want global south energy industries essentially owned by private capital? Won't that bring a whole host of new problems, private capital from the north? So there are many problems associated with, but the big one is the money is not showing up. Another disadvantage of climate clubs is that it may drive geopolitical tensions, which God knows we don't need at this time, particularly, for instance, with China, but also with India, other BRICS countries, which are outside the climate club, who may be angry that their exports are being penalized, that essentially these measures undermine free trade, which undoubtedly they do. They are designed to undermine free trade and are not compatible with the global goal of trade agreements to have free trade. They are a major undermining of those norms and rules under the WTO, for instance, the World Trade Organization. So we have to improve this picture. What are our options? How do we bring pressure to bear on the government-to-government negotiations of the UNFCCC? This framework that we've got that sets how governments behave. One theory is that we need to bring global public opinion to bear on this process, because survey after survey demonstrates that global public opinion is more ambitious than governments. Ordinary people, if you want to call them that, understand that climate is an existential risk, needs to be addressed, is deeply associated with the challenges of development and inequality, because of course the impacts of climate change, global heating, will impact less developed countries, poorer people first and worst, even if they're not responsible for the problem in the first place. And people understand that. If you're Pakistani, where you've just suffered incredible floods of perhaps 70% of the country in an absolutely extraordinary catastrophic event, you understand that climate change is a problem, perhaps better than your own government, certainly better than the Saudi government or the Russian government. So how do you bring this public opinion to bear? Well, one effort at the moment going on is what's called a global citizens assembly, whereby a representative sample of the world population from India, Yemen, the Marshalls, Argentina, would be selected by a kind of randomized process that is also proportional to the populations of the world, proportional to North and South, a process called sortition. And this would produce an assembly of perhaps 400 people from around the world who would then deliberate climate solutions. And that deliberation would involve consultations with experts. It would involve a kind of education process for those who didn't know about climate. And the idea would be that would then deliver a set of recommendations or proposals, which would then be presented to the COP. And next year's COP is going to be in Brazil, in the Amazonian city of Belém. And the group that is working on this, which I'm associated with, wants to present the assembly conclusions to the Belém COP. Brazil is very sympathetic to participatory democracy. It's been one of the real champions of participatory democracy, bottom-up decision-making in the national realm, but also in the local city realm. For instance, in Porto Alegre, the classic example of the success of participatory budgeting, as it's known. So Brazil is amongst the countries of the world, perhaps the most, if not among the more sympathetic to this kind of process. My question about it, though, is will such a thing actually move the dial? Will it actually shift governments? And I'm afraid to say my provisional conclusion, because I would be very glad to be wrong about this, is pessimistic. Namely, that governments, I know, having been in government myself, I know exactly how governments respond to this kind of thing. Say, if you're the Danish government, a right-thinking, progressive, ambitious, climate ambitious country, relatively, you will say, wonderful, Brazil, that you brought us the conclusions of the Global Citizens Assembly. We are very, very grateful. These conclusions are very important. Now, please let us go back into the room and do our negotiations with all the other governments, and the door slams behind them. Civil society, as ever, is left outside in the corridors to twiddle their thumbs whilst the real people do their work in the government negotiations. That's a cynical way of looking at it, but there's a certain truth to that. The other truth is that delegates at the COP get it. They know perfectly well that climate is a big problem. They are aware of the science. They read the IPCC reports. They are paid to do so. They're not really the problem. The problem is the governments that make the policy. The COP has become this kind of iconic moment of global action on climate. But of course, the problem is much deeper than that. Governments understand that they need to make the energy transition, but there are many reasons why they don't do it fast enough. If you like, the framework in which governments operate. So what is that framework? It is short-term. They think about their short-term popularity, winning the next elections, not getting bad headlines, not being seen to impose unnecessary costs on their short-term costs on their population. They do not think long-term. That's self-evident. They also are trapped in a kind of neoliberal mental framework that they must compete, they must grow as fast as possible. This makes sense if you're a global South country. It makes a lot less sense if you're a global North country. And I'm using these terms very generally. I have my own critique of global North and global South, but we can go into that later if you wish. The terms global North and global South. They are locked into this mental framework of neoliberalism, which bedevils us even in this country, where we have a new government that talks about growth, growth, growth as the big goal, where those IPCC reports and the emerging science, brought to us by degrowth experts such as Tim Perrig and Jason Hickel, Kate Raworth and her donut economics. To an extent, she is not a degrowther, but she argues that we ought to concentrate on the well-being economy rather than prioritizing growth. And if we are to make the climate targets of Paris, it is pretty evident that that is the kind of economics we need to follow. Redistribution, focusing on welfare, focusing on public goods, rather than a small proportion of the population getting massively richer and causing huge amounts of carbon emissions. It's not complicated, but it does seem to be beyond the ken of many governments, with the exception of perhaps Costa Rica and one or two others, New Zealand, who understand that we need to shift this economic paradigm. So those are two reasons. They're not the only two reasons why governments are unable to shift. There's also the immense inertia of being in government. Government servants, as I know, very busy, always think they're doing something very important. There's very little time for them to sit back and think about planetary destruction, for instance. Though I know on a personal level that many of them do understand this. It's somehow translating this consciousness into their work. So this leads to a different theory of change, a different paradigm of how we might shift things, is that we actually need to shift this framework in which governments think and operate. I don't want to get into the whole debate about protest. I have my own views about that, particularly this last few days where we've seen these appalling sentences on Just Stop Oil activists. That isn't the theory I'm going to talk about. Instead, it's a more fundamental, if you like, epistemic shift. The knowledge, the collection of beliefs, the discourse in which governments operate, the sea in which they swim. That is the thing we need to shift to a more long-term perspective. one that thinks about future generations. On that, just a side note, there is to be a UN summit of the future this September. And I'm afraid to say the outcomes of that summit will demonstrate, because they're already being negotiated, how short-term governments tend to think, how little imagination they have, how little account they make of the genuine needs of future generations in their policy calculations. It's proof of this problem that I've been talking about, of the framework of government thinking. So we need to drive change in that epistemic community, in that intellectual paradigm. How do we do that? Well, I think there are many ways to do that. Experts, writers, analysts have their place, of course, but there is also a role for more bottom-up change in our local communities, in the places where we work. And I know this plays into the climate majorities theory of change as well. There is a responsibility upon each of us, not so much to, use energy efficient light bulbs, but more to manifest the change, to talk about that necessary change, to learn about the necessary science and policy shifts that we need to see, and shift the discourse. Talk to your MP. I'm not a big believer in representative democracy as an anarchist. We have a top-down system in this government where the people who make the decisions are a tiny few. But shift the narrative. I guess that's the kind of way of talking about it. That, to me, is the challenge. And if we can, we begin to make a difference. That's what I'm working on in several different ways, including globally, an attempt to shift the discourse from the bottom up through global democracy practice from the bottom up. That is one method. It's certainly not the only method. There are multiple ways to skin this cat. I'm a believer in complexity theory that tells us that we don't necessarily know what will shift the system as a whole. Change is not linear. It may be one small thing that shifts the whole system when it's at criticality or a tipping point. It may be many things. It may be one big thing. It may be a small group of people. It may be all of those things. We don't know. And what that suggests is that we all need to put our shoulders to that wheel. I'm going to conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. It gets us off to a most brilliant start in this webinar. So as promised, I'm going to offer you a couple of questions to get the ball rolling. While I do so, everyone else, please do be thinking about your questions, and you can start to put them in the chat if you wish to do so. So, Carl, I'll start where you ended up there, where, as you said, there is a really significant confluence, I think, between the kind of thinking you've been trying to bring and what we're trying to bring in the Climate Majority Project. The ungainsayable importance of shifting the narrative, of a massive, basically citizen-led shift. The realization that to look to our leaders to, of their own volition, lead on this kind of thing and actually get us out of the desperate trouble that we're in, is to look in vain. And the leadership needs to start from somewhere else. But let me put that alongside what you said earlier in your talk at the start, really, your kind of qualified defense of the UNFCCC. I guess one of the things that I think is that if this citizen leadership is going to start to really arise, one of the things it's probably going to take and contribute to is some further and justified decline in the willingness to kind of outsource faith to other institutions. So let me put it this way. As long as people carry on thinking, well, at least we've got the UNFCCC and the COP process, and they're the international leaders who are supposed to be sorting this out, doesn't that make it difficult for citizens to start to step into their full power and insist upon something different? Whereas if that COP system, the UNFCCC, starts to fall apart, well, then there's room for something new. And isn't the reason for thinking that maybe, despite the fascinating things you told us about the Marshall Islands leadership in relation to what's been achieved in the UNFCCC process, isn't there some reason for thinking that since that occurred, well, that decline has actually begun? I'm talking about the upsurge in oil lobbying in the last few years in the COP process. I'm talking about what seems to be an increasing detachment from reality. So the leader of the last COP, the chair of the last COP, said there's no problem in achieving 1.5 while continuing to burn fossil fuels and have new fossil fuels. Just a kind of a wildly crazy idea, given that it seems that we're going through 1.5 already. And therefore, there is basically no room for burning virtually any more fossil fuels. So that's my first question to you. Is it problematic to try to say, as you have, on the one hand, well, there's still a role for the UNFCCC, and on the other hand, we need something really new in terms of a citizen-led approach?
Well, I think we can hold both thoughts in our head at once. This is a sophisticated audience. I wouldn't necessarily say this to another audience, where I'd probably be more negative about the UNFCCC. But the UNFCCC is not going away. It remains the main framework for government-to-government action. One of the remarkable things about it is that 193 countries every year agree a single outcome text at the COP, which is a kind of remarkable achievement given the other geopolitical conflicts and tensions that we are experiencing at the moment. So I would repeat, I don't think it's valueless. We should certainly pressurize it. We should certainly highlight the fact that oil lobbyists are gathering around it. But in a sense, it's where these pressures kind of converge, where the rubber hits the road. So, my advice to our clients and independent diplomat was always, engage. If you ignore a place, your voice will not be heard. They'll carry on without you. So I think that thought can coexist with the necessity of a different kind of paradigmatic change. I'm not a defender of the UNFCCC as you described me at the beginning of your
I said
question.
qualified defense.
Qualified. I'm not even a qualified defender.
Okay,
I'm a critic. I think it's rubbish.
Yes.
I think it's rubbish,
Okay,
but it's
right.
not. It is not to be ignored just because it's rubbish. That's my point.
Yes. Okay. Well, let me connect that with my next question, which is, so at the end of the day, there's a fundamental difficulty with the COP process, right? And it's obviously implicit in the fundamental advantage of it. You have 193 countries there. You've got to try to herd 193 cats together. It's an almost kind of insanely difficult diplomatic task. This is why it's extraordinary that the Paris Agreement was agreed at all in 2015. And a remarkable, unprecedented, pretty much, diplomatic achievement. But isn't that itself, for starters, a very good reason for thinking that there is quite a strong role for some kind of climate club type approach? So Simon Sharp has talked about this, for example, in his book 5 Times Faster, quite powerfully. He says, look, what you can actually achieve with bringing 193 countries to agree a text is bound to be kind of quite lowest common denominator, quite slow. There has to be some kind of coalition of the willing type approach, which is able and willing to move faster. And we are now seeing a number of actual or potential climate clubs coming into being, right? So another one is the US EU Green Steel Club, for example. And then there are much more diverse kind of multilateral kind of coalitions of people who are trying to bring various kinds of higher ambition, including around coal and other stuff. At the end of the day, isn't the COP process exposed to this awful kind of wicked collective action problem type situation, which it's bound to stay exposed to, and which means it's never going to achieve as much as needs to be achieved, precisely because it has to try to bring everyone together.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Though I disagree that it's the lowest common denominator process. There is a certain pressure that is exerted inside the COP process. And it's worth emphasizing that the UNFCCC process is actually a continual negotiation. It just comes to a head
Yeah,
every year in the
yeah,
monthly negotiations at the COP. There is a pre-negotiation that takes place often in Bonn called the SBs. I don't even know what it stands for, but it's a kind of pre-negotiation of the COP. And of course, climate diplomats talk to each other all the time.
yeah.
There are particular points in the timetable which, where they gather. Um, it is more than lowest common denominator. It's not right to say it's lowest common denominator. And the other thing that defenders of the process would say is that you are seeing that the nationally determined commitments are getting better. That year by year, we're seeing the estimated temperature that those commitments would bring about is lowering. It was something like 5 degrees centigrade. It's now 2.9. And if we continue that ratchet, and there is a ratchet built into Paris saying that countries need to improve their commitments every 5 years, that was one of the achievements of the High Ambition Coalition, by the way, that ratchet. And it was invented around the table of independent diplomat, I dare say. But that ratchet forces countries, obliges them to improve their commitments on a regular basis. That is not nothing. How else, you tell me how else you're going to persuade Azerbaijan or Russia or Nigeria to improve their commitments? We have to deal with those countries. We have to not accept, but combat what they're saying in the negotiation chamber. There's also other ways to address those countries, but that is one. And I'm loath to discard a tool that is on the table, even if it is an imperfect tool.
Yes, although of course the word commitments is possibly misleading, right? Because the INDCs, there is a quite an important sense in which they are voluntary commitments, and to what extent is a voluntary commitment really a commitment? I mean, that plays into my final question, and after this, I'll go to the room. So please be ready with your questions and ready to raise your hand. And here, this really comes to the absolute nub of the awfulness of the climate predicament, and to truth telling in its biggest sense. At the end of the day, climate is something like a wicked collective action problem. That arguably understates it. It's a predicament. It's even the term emergency arguably understates the situation that we're in. We the chances that we are actually going to get countries like Russia and Azerbaijan and the USA, for that matter, to do what is necessary must be seen objectively to be extraordinarily low. This has all sorts of implications, including around adaptation and loss and damage, right? One has to have grave skepticism that even getting down to a maximum ceiling of 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees, is achievable, and humanity is, as a result, going to experience difficulties which make the current situation look like a walk in the park. And here I want to address you quite directly and kind of personally, Carne. What do you feel about this, and what do other climate diplomats, etc., feel about this? Is there a need to enable the populations of the world to understand better the extent to which this is not a problem which is going to get solved, and the extent to which, therefore, we're going to have to deal as a species with some horrible and disastrous consequences as the next generation or two unfold?
Yeah, lots of questions in there, Rupert. I'll try to be brief. Um, Look, I mean, my big point is that we cannot look to governments to fix it for the
Yeah,
reasons I've explained. We cannot look to the UNFCCC to fix it. Climate diplomats that I know are very caught up in the process. They think getting the word phase out next to coal rather than phase down is progress. When what really matters is how many coal-powered power stations China is building or not building. So they tend to be very focused on this highly technocratic process that carries them along. It's very busy, it's very demanding, they work very hard. So I wouldn't put too much stock in that. Though on the other hand, they do understand the science, at least many of them do. And the ones from the most vulnerable states speak with great passion about this, whether it's Bangladesh or the island states. Climate diplomats are very determined advocates for the needs of their countries, and I take that very seriously. If they take it seriously, I take it seriously. I don't think me sitting in judgment in London is fair. If these diplomats are struggling to get better outcomes, I want to help them. But at the same time, we shouldn't rely on that process. We should do what we can to shift the paradigm ourselves. I oscillate between these things.
Yes.
I'm not sure. I don't think anybody should be sure. There are many ways to address this, whether it's accelerating the take-up of renewables or new technology. I don't dismiss that either, though it's not enough now. It's not only government policy, it's also what we ourselves do. I do think, I believe in the emergency. I look at the emerging science and I'm extremely concerned about it. I don't think we can carry on business as usual. I have become convinced of the degrowth argument over the last year or two when I've looked very closely at the arguments. There are arguments on either side of the degrowth debate, which are serious arguments and to be taken seriously. But I have dedicated my life to this problem, amongst other problems. But what I don't understand is why more people don't dedicate their lives to it. I guess they have no choice. In a sense, it's a privilege to be able to.
Yes. Carl, thank you so much. We're going to go to the room now. I'm going to come first to Mark, Dick, and then to Kimberly Hare. Mark, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much, Con, for your talk. I'm interested in Joe Linen and Andreas Bummel's work on a world parliament and whether they're making any progress at the UN. They propose that there could be degrowth and a more long-term thinking built into that, and maybe that's a way to get things like progressive global wealth tax, global food policy, global water policy, etc. Do you think there's any mileage in a world parliament in conjunction with the Citizens Assembly that you mentioned earlier?
I think a citizens' assembly is much more likely to come about because it doesn't depend on the consent of governments. Having argued for a world parliament in one of my books, I don't actually believe it's a plausible answer. There is not the slightest chance that the member states of the UN will agree to it. In fact, it was put on the table by civil society for this UN Summit of the Future, and no state expressed any interest in championing it. There's a huge mountain in the way in terms of the indifference of member states. They don't believe in real democracy. Even the democratic ones don't believe in it. And certainly there's plenty of countries that don't believe in democracy, including at home. So they don't want a parliament. But what there might be is something separate that then delivers its opinions to the government process. And that would become a pole of attraction, a flag in the ground for the rest of us to orient around, to say that the Citizens Assembly has produced these recommendations. These must now be the point around which we organize our efforts and policy must be made. That's the theory of change. I have to admit, I'm a little bit pessimistic about that because I've been with governments, and governments think, like the British government, but all of them think they are legitimate. They think they speak for their people. They think, what's a world parliament? What's a citizens' assembly? It's just a kind of fancy focus group. Who the hell cares what they say? We represent our people. And that is the basic presumption that I think we've got to tackle. That we say, you're not representing me. You're not fixing the problems that concern me. We need something else. That's why I'm an anarchist. I believe in a fundamental change of the way we govern ourselves in all kinds of different realms. So I don't think a world parliament, I'm afraid, best of intentions, I'm not convinced it's a plausible solution.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Kim, over to you. Will you unmute and ask your question, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Rupert. Thank you so much, Carl. That was brilliant. My question is this. You've talked about the importance of systems thinking and complexity thinking, but everybody, including you in your talk, seem to be operating from the premise that the fundamental problem is decarbonisation. Surely the fundamental problem is overshoot, and a transition to a different source of energy simply makes the whole superorganism grow faster, as in Jevons paradox. We've all seen the graphs showing that as the use of renewables rises, which is great, so does every other form of energy use. So I just wonder, to what extent in the circles you operate in, how much understanding is there of that?
Thanks, Kimberly. I did also say I believe in degrowth. I believe in contracting the size of the economy, reducing consumption, particularly amongst rich countries, not for developing countries. So, I also believe it not only for green energy reasons, but also for protecting biodiversity, which we haven't talked about, but is also under grave threat, is being destroyed at an unsustainable rate. So I agree. I think the degrowth argument is making headway internationally. The European Commission organized a conference at the European Parliament about degrowth, which was supported, I think, by every major party at the European Parliament, except the People's Party, the Conservatives. In the Summit of the Future, the Secretary General recommended that there be a kind of expert group set up to examine indices of progress beyond GDP. So people are starting to talk about ideas like the well-being economy, donut economics, stuff like that. Those ideas are making headway. I don't think we're anything close to degrowth becoming a dominant intellectual paradigm. And I've argued with Jason Hickel and others that degrowth is a very bad term for it because it implies less for all of us, when that's not what he's in fact talking about. So, I think a bit of a diversity of debate would help us. But I do sense that post-capitalism, the situation we're in is under question by more and more people. And more people are looking for a kind of new paradigm of how to think economically, and well-being economics, if we want to call it that, is a plausible answer to that. So it is beginning to spread.
Tim, do you want to come back on that at all? Fine. Liam, I think you have a thought that is relevant to this exchange between Kim and Khan. Liam Kavanagh, my co-director. Do you want to come in quickly?
No, not really. I mean, I just think, well, it's worth mentioning that, well, no, actually, I really don't. I'd actually rather, if there's another question I could ask, which is much more pushing back on your original question, Rupert, but maybe I could ask that later on. Is there a bystander effect? Are we maybe underestimating that if the more that we treat COP as in some way a credible threat to actually reduce emissions, does that not give people, I mean, basically one of the most basic effects in psychology is that if people think something is somebody else's job and somebody else raises their hand and says, I'm going to solve this, then people don't do anything. Right. And so, I mean, the other way of talking about this is called spoiling the field. Right. And so, although I really get what Carne is saying about, I don't want to criticize diplomats who are put in their position by their country to do something through COP. I mean, they have this responsibility, and of course they want to take that seriously, do what they can through this process. But at the same time, if critics are not saying that, look, fundamentally, there's no real reason to believe that this can deliver, I do think that has a great incentive to decrease people's action, particularly because every person is already feels so unable and disempowered to do something, right? Like those are precisely the situations in which the bystander effect is incredibly powerful, when people feel almost no agency of themselves and somebody else raises their hand and says, I've got this. Then, I think that's probably the most immobilizing situation, right? Where the appearance of somebody who can solve the problem can basically discourage people from acting. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, maybe I didn't make my point clear enough, but I believe that we need to conclude that governments are not solving the problem. That's precise. I mean, I've written a whole book about why we need to conclude that governments are not solving our problems, that we need to act ourselves, the leaderless revolution. So yeah, I get it. But I think with this audience, I think we can also understand that particularly for the most vulnerable countries, cops have a certain value. It doesn't mean they are fixing it and the rest of us can do nothing. But I'm not willing to dismiss the Marshall Islands' willingness to participate in that process because they think it has value for them. I'm not going to tell them that.
Well, I mean, I guess it's the same question. Can we amplify the Marshall Islands? Like they're engaging in it. Can we say,
Well,
look,
that's what I've spent 7 years of my life doing.
Right, but I'm just saying, but I'm just saying in terms of languaging how we actually appeal to an audience, isn't it something like, look at this process, this Marshall Islands is doing everything they possibly can to get something out of it, and using it to foreground those people who are engaging in it at the same time. The rest of us, our job in many ways is to say as powerfully as possible that this won't deliver for them, right? They both have sympathy for it, and this is unfortunately the best avenue that they're provided by international networks or international institutions to do something, and it's simply not good enough.
Look, I mean, the organization I founded helped the Marshall Islands create a coalition of 100 countries that was responsible for us talking about 1.5 rather than 2. That's kind of a big deal. And I think that's worth doing. And I don't think we have the right to sit there and say, it's not good enough. If it's good enough for Tony de Broom, it's good enough for me. That's my conclusion. Of course, you're absolutely right. We must amplify what they're doing.
Carne, does that continue to be the case after we sail through 1.5? i.e. now?
It doesn't change the conclusion. It's not good enough. That's what.
Yeah.
I'm not. You seem to be seeing me as some kind of defender of the cops. I'm not. It's not good enough. Have I made myself clear?
Yeah, very good, very good. Okay, let's move on to a couple more questions. So I'm going to come next to Vicky Moller and then to Alicia Hull. Vicky, will you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Oh, thanks. So starting with the last one, Carne, you don't have to answer as if you're responsible for the entire situation. This should be a discussion bottom up. So I'm involved in sort of lifeboat building more self-reliant and low carbon economy locally. And I realize that's piddly, tiny, not going to change the world. But how I can't see what else to do. I kind of gave up on the Titanic. And this is just a question without a clear, I don't know what answer I'm looking for, but I don't know how to reconcile the bottom up with the top. And that's the main question. But then just querying what you mean by growth, because if it's GDP, there's nothing wrong with that. It just means people are trading. What's wrong is extracting things without replacing them, particularly fossil fuels. If we remove that element from the equation, the problem would dwindle, would wither away with a bit of help. I don't know if these questions are clear enough, but that will do.
Yeah, look, I mean, I've total sympathy. I think this difference between the top and us, the atomic level, is very difficult to reconcile. I find it difficult to reconcile, and I know both worlds quite well. But I do believe in the power of bottom-up action. I do believe that what people do at their own level has the ability to spread. It spreads ideas, it spreads practice. Humans are mimetic, imitative creatures, and somebody may see you and be inspired to do something themselves. That is impact, far more impact than a diplomat changing a comma in a paragraph. Obviously, we have to do both. Obviously, we have to push and push and push on both. So this kind of binary of one or the other, and do we dismiss the UNFCCC? I mean, we can push hard on all levels and demand better from our governments, but also act ourselves to change the basic way that people think about this issue. That's what I'm claiming. That's where I concluded.
Can I come back very briefly, just to say perhaps we should puncture the bubbles, because the problem isn't that both happen, but we need to create communication so that people doing this on the ground communicate upwards, and people at the top can experience the joys of fossil fuel reduced economies at the bottom, because they are done well, much more rewarding on every level.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what Just Stop Oil are trying to do, aren't they? Including
No, they're not. They're
the
just
bubble. There are lots of different ways of puncturing the bubble. We don't have to choose one way. There are many ways to solve or address this problem. Many ways, and I don't know which one is going to work.
If I could step into this discussion, Vicky, I think that the way that the Climate Majority Project would be oriented to seeing what you're bringing, as Carne is saying, actually, is that there is a lot that is needed, and that we need to see, for example, the best diplomatic efforts and the best efforts to engage in adaptation and resilience building on a hyperlocal basis as all part of the same broad wave of action that is pointing us in the direction we need to go in. And that's really part of what we're trying to bring, is the sense of giving people that collective awareness of being part of this wave, which gives a sense of agency and of the possibility that one day what we're doing could actually amount to being enough. And that there are a lot of things needed, although what is needed needs to be effective, which is where the question comes in that some of us raise in relation to Just Stop Oil. But let's not go into that one further right now. Let's go to Alicia, and then after that it will be Brendan. Alicia, do unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah. I wrote a book, It's All Up to Us Now, which tracked the way monetarist policies had destroyed democracy in the UK. And I came to the conclusion that only the public could have the power, the imagination, and the will to act in time to avert a climate catastrophe. And I was sort of doing that all on my own. And then I discovered that the M25 in Europe, across Europe, including the UK, included thousands of people having conversations to deliver grassroots policies. And since then, I've been working with a citizen network, which is also using webinars and tapping into existing reports and other people's sort of work to produce a manifesto for sustainability in concentrating on farming, food and wildlife. And my sort of plea is, or my question is, it is a plea really, why are all the people, there's so many different groups doing their best about climate to avert the climate disaster? Why are they not talking about these people who are already making grassroots policies? And why don't they contribute to those policies and enlarge them? Because, I mean, if we get a public manifesto with considerable support, one of the demands should be that the government, we have a government of national unity, which is ultimately controlled by citizens' assemblies to tackle the climate emergency and to reset our system of democracy, because representative democracy has failed so badly. Wouldn't that be a really good way of changing, a really strong way of changing the dialogue? I'm sort of afraid that so many groups are doing parallel work, and the idea of coming together for a common manifesto would enhance what we're doing and give us much more power.
Well, look, I agree with you of the need to recognize and celebrate what's being done across the world in terms of grassroots movements and change. That to me is the main motor of change, because I think the history of social change shows that society changes before government changes. For instance, in women's rights or LGBTQ rights, it was social attitudes that changed before the law changed. So I wholeheartedly believe in that model. I guess, it's far less important, but I'm a little bit skeptical of common manifestos. I certainly believe in bottom-up democracy of the kind I believe in people's assemblies where everybody has a say in their affairs. That's what I believe in. And I don't necessarily see the need to aggregate that into a single set of demands. I think we are diverse and people want different things. We are a group of people on this call who particularly care about climate, but not everybody does. And we need to address them in a face-to-face forum, such as a People's Assembly, and that place should be making decisions about the stuff that matters to us. So that, to me, we need to invert democracy from a top-down system to a bottom-up system. And in a sense, the up doesn't really need to exist at all, in my view. So I guess I'm a bit skeptical about the effort to produce a single manifesto, but if you think it's important, then it obviously is.
Well, it's a way of uniting people and getting as wide a possible input into it. I mean, the importance of citizens' assemblies seems recognised, but DM worked by conversations more, which is, cheaper, considerably cheaper than citizens' assemblies. They had lots and lots of local conversations, which then produced ideas, went through a sort of 6-stage process of putting up ideas and asking for comments and having more discussion and that sort of thing. But they've produced some extremely useful policies. I mean, their Green New Deal for Europe, it's focused on European banks and European institutions, but it could equally apply to the British ones. And it does decentralize government, democratize government, give people ensure that people have knowledge and have power to make changes. So it's, it's a very, very, it addresses climate change with ecocide and pollution.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. Carne, any more to answer there?
I agree with everything that Alicia's just said. It's a very necessary and important mechanism of change. I just wanted to add something in. I met the other day at a conference somebody called Jojo Mehta, who leads the organization that promotes the idea of ecocide as a new international law or norm. And I remember first meeting this organization about 7 years ago. And I thought, this has got no chance. They were trying to recruit the Marshall Islands to support ecocide. And I was very against it because I said the Marshall Islands is about one thing. We can't, they're not big enough to do multiple different policy efforts. And I was very skeptical that ecocide would gain traction as an idea. And I was totally wrong. It really has gained traction. There is a lot of people, a lot of countries now talking about it as a plausible new international initiative and law. So it just shows that, I mean, this was the brainchild of, I think, one person initially. It just shows that, these ideas have enormous potential to spread when people recognize the danger we're in.
Great. Thank you, Carne. Over now to Brendan Devlin. And Brendan, you're a climate negotiator with the European Commission. So great to have you here. What would you like to tell us in relation to this conversation, or what would you like to ask?
Well, thank you. Yes, I was going to say that. Just for full disclosure, I do work at the European Commission. I lead a team on reducing methane emissions for the European Union, and work at global level also to put in place what was called the global methane pledge. I just wanted to say how much it's appreciated by negotiators to have civil society give us ideas, and it is often not recognized how much you do influence the top level. Most of the work that we have done on methane emissions reduction has come from academic and civil society sources, and we have worked on it very much over the last 3 years. We are now seeing a decline in methane emissions globally for the first time. I also wanted to say one other thing, which is that we're now in a situation, at least for the European Union, of reducing absolute consumption of oil, gas, and coal. So for natural gas, it will start next year, oil in 2 to 3 years' time, coal, it's not quite sure when there will be a decline. So this dynamic allows for a much greater choice from where oil, gas, and coal is bought and under what circumstances. That is the option, or gives us the option, to have a supply side policy. It always amazes me that we don't have in the European Union, or indeed at global level, a supply side policy. We focus always on what you and I and the population are doing, and try to reduce consumption. As an analogy, take illicit drugs, or don't take illicit drugs, perhaps. No American government would ever say the way to control drug use is to talk about it and reduce consumption at domestic level. They would go after the suppliers. We are in a situation that if you go after suppliers now, you can exercise choices. We need to destabilize the status quo, particularly amongst the hydrocarbon suppliers. And if I could give any feed into your discussions, the destabilization of the hydrocarbon front, the common front of the hydrocarbon suppliers at global level, that would be the way forward. You already see some breaking of ranks between hydrocarbon suppliers who feel that they will be excluded in the declining market. And I think that's something that should be exploited by civil society. One way of doing this is to emphasize a just transition, saying the global south should have priority for development over paying a rich country even more money for more oil and gas. But those are just thoughts. But also just to emphasize, we do listen to civil society. And if I can say anything, it's really, really helpful to have you outside the room saying, we need more from you guys inside the room. Thanks.
Thanks, Brendan. Stay with us, Carne. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Yeah, I don't have any comment on what Brendan has just said. Nothing I disagree with there. You know, a confirmation of the fact that activism and pressure on the governmental process matters. I don't dismiss that at all, but I also say, you know, what governments are doing is insufficient, and therefore we need to act ourselves.
Yeah. Brendan, can I pose briefly to you the question I posed earlier to Carne? How do you and your colleagues deal with the worry that this wicked collective action predicament is showing every sign, especially over the last year, with us seeming to rupture the 1.5 barrier in real time? It's showing every sign of while we've made some progress on it, of basically not being in our control. And we look like we are headed into a very, very difficult future where there's going to need to be a lot more emphasis on loss and damage and adaptation, and not just emphasis on mitigation. We in the Climate Majority Project think that strategic adaptation and transformative adaptation are now absolutely essential priorities for societies to deal with the impacts that are coming. Are people thinking about this a lot at the European Commission? Are people feeling it?
I have to be very careful about what I'm saying. We don't have a European Commission at the moment, so we don't have any policies. We're in this sort of interregnum between
Yes.
the old Mrs. von der Leyen and the new Mrs. von der Leyen. But can I say one thing potentially is that the collective action problem is being redefined. If you go from a situation where you have 160 oil and gas suppliers and a UN process which has, I don't know, Carne maybe knows, 300 countries involved, or 300 plus countries. The new way of looking at reduction of hydrocarbon use and CO2 and methane emissions reduction is to think about who is actually buying the stuff. If at global level you look at who's buying the stuff, there are 5 jurisdictions which buy 80 to 90% of all traded oil and gas.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can get those 5 jurisdictions to agree, you can have a huge impact at a short time. And the collective action problem is much, much less.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than trying to get the oil producing states to agree to something which attacks their interests, all you need to do is to have a climate club of the 5 countries that, or the 5 jurisdictions, should I say, that import the majority of the oil and gas and coal, and they are European Union, Japan, Korea, China, India, and possibly Turkey as the last one. But if you could get those, or even a subset of those countries to agree, the premium markets are Korea, Japan, and the European Union. If you could get those countries to agree on a set of requirements, that would be sufficient to see change in the hydrocarbon supply chain, in our view. So we're trying to move away from this idea of getting everybody to agree to everything in the future, and try to go towards having subsets, groups that agree on very specific things which can be implemented in the short term.
Super. Carne, let me invite you to respond to that thought from Brendan, and this will be our final substantive moment in this webinar, I think. Carne.
Absolutely. Nothing to disagree with what Brendan said. A climate club of that kind would be immensely powerful. We are unfortunately a long way from that. You know, the national plans of these governments, the places that consume the most fossil fuels are where the rubber hits the road. And we have to concentrate on that. I mean, China, for instance, we need a big diplomatic effort with China to say that what they're doing really matters and that we value the progress that they're making, but it needs to be faster. Likewise with the US. I mean, I would elevate climate in terms of international diplomacy. I don't really understand why it's treated in the way that it is, as a kind of separate pillar of activity with its own separate community of diplomats, when it ought to be central.
Yeah, and if climate were considered as a part of everything else, which of course it is, and vice versa, that could be a massive game changer. We think that applies also to the media as well, that it doesn't really make sense for climate stories to be separated off from everything else anymore. They need to be seen as a dimension of most stories that are out there. Any very final thoughts from you, Carne, or possibly a final response from Brendan, if you have something on what we just said just there, as we move towards wrap up? Nothing for you, Brendan. Carne, any last reflection on this conversation?
I've said what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming here this morning to this webinar. Thanks, everybody. We hope you've had a good breakfast, and this gets you off to a good start to your day. I invite you, if you wish, to open your mics and to give Carne a collective thank you from us all. We've got stuff going on in the in the chat, but also do open your mics and say thank you, or indeed feel free to clap as if we were in a room together, which perhaps one of these days we will be.
Or jeer, whichever you prefer.
Brilliant. Thanks, everybody. And as you heard from Sam, watch this space. We'll be having these webinars on roughly a monthly basis going forward. So we look forward to seeing you at the next one. The recording of this webinar will be made available fairly soon. Do share it with others who you would like to get the benefit of retrospectively hearing what we've had to say to each other here this morning. Thanks, everybody, and goodbye.